Let's go ahead and jump in. Welcome everyone to the NEMSIS V3 implementation call. This morning is June 24th. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to be here with us. We also really appreciate your feedback and input, comments and questions. Please feel free to ask those and participate in this conversation. We really appreciate that. We're going to go ahead and start off this morning. Clay is going to introduce our newest NEMSIS team member. Clay, why don't you go ahead and take it away and we'll just jump in.
Okay, yeah, happy to do that, and equally happy to introduce Sujata to the folks on the call. She is the latest member to join the NEMSIS team. She is a web software developer, and she's also attending school here at the University of Utah, completing a master's degree in information systems. She will work with Laurel and will take over as the NEMSIS compliance officer as Laurel continues to train her. She'll also be responsible for maintaining the NEMSIS standard, much as Laurel has, and she'll also be the administrator for NEMSIS.org. So we're great. It's been great having her with us, and we look forward to great things with her. So as you work through the compliance process, either as a renewal or for 3.5, you'll get to know Sujata. She'll be a great person to work with. Now I know both her and Laurel have to jump off the line pretty quickly, so I'll just end there so Laurel can finish the second item. I know she's got to attend an AWS meeting. So thanks everyone.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about our maintenance this month in June and then next month in July. So during the June maintenance window, we ended up having to change the IP address for our submissions web service. And for some vendors that were whitelisting IP addresses, this turned out to be a little bit of an issue because their submissions, of course, stopped. So I would just ask that we are exploring some ways that we can work with vendors that are doing this to maybe lessen the possibility of issues in the future. IP addresses will probably change. We can probably limit the change to a range of IP addresses. But if we are doing maintenance, I would encourage you to please take a look at your systems after that window has ended and we've sent out the completion message, just to ensure that submissions are still flowing and there haven't been any unexpected changes that are stopping that data on your end. It's a little harder for us to figure out when your submissions are failing, because what we see is, in this case, we didn't see failures. We just saw that submissions had stopped from several states. So just want to make everyone aware of that potential issue. I'll pause here for a second if anyone has any questions about that. Okay, so for the July maintenance window, I just want to give everyone a little bit of a heads up on what we're going to be doing. We are going to be doing a number of maintenance tasks, but we have two that will potentially have an effect on our vendors and other users. The first thing is we're going to be disabling TLS 1.1 on all services that we offer, every web service. Right now, TLS 1.1 is disabled on some of our newer compliance testing services. But after the July window, it will be disabled for all services, submissions, you name it. So if you are still utilizing TLS 1.1, I would encourage you to migrate as fast as possible to 1.2 for a good number of reasons. It's no longer recommended, it's deprecated, and we're going to be removing it. So that's the first thing. The second item is that we are going to discontinue the old validator and compliance services. So many of you I know have already started using our new validator and compliance services, but we have left those old ones standing. So if you're still making submissions to the old validator and compliance, the ones with I don't know how to explain the difference. They have R2 in the URL. Please stop using those services. Go to the NEMSIS website, go to the web services page, and grab the URLs for the new services, which are going to be at validator.nemsis.org and compliance.nemsis.org. So just please double check that if you're using those services that you're pointed at the new ones. because the old ones will be coming down during the July maintenance window. And that's everything I have. Does anyone have any questions about maintenance?
Will there be an email or anything that goes out detailing all of that, so I can make sure with our IT department that's all been completed before the maintenance happens?
Yeah, so we'll send out, we usually send out a Friday before email for maintenance. So on Friday the 3rd, and then we send out a completion when it's done, which would be Wednesday the 8th, I think. I might have those dates wrong. I don't have them right in front of me. But I can send out an email after this call detailing what items will be addressed in July maintenance, if that would be helpful.
It would be. Thank you.
Okay, I will do that.
Any other questions for Laurel? Okay, thank you, Laurel. We'll jump into the next item, and that's just a quick chat on the annual V3 implementation meeting. So as most of you know, we've adjusted that to be a virtual meeting. We're still hammering out some topics. We had some great discussion on our last call, and we're taking to heart all of the comments and suggestions from last week or 2 weeks ago, the V3 call, but also the DMC call. We really appreciate your feedback on that. So we've sent out this Survey Monkey for some input on topics. We want to make sure that we're bringing in those discussions that are most meaningful to you. I'm going to go ahead and put this, let's see if I can. Let's put this in the chat. So if you haven't had a chance to fill out the survey, we are happy to have you do that. We're going to go ahead and close that end of business day today. Take your comments, the ones that you've given us in person and over the phone, suggestions from the Survey Monkey, and really try and dial in the topics. And then once we have a good idea on the issues that we want to include, then we'll push out the dates and times. We know you guys are anxious to get those on your calendar, and we're really sensitive to your scheduling needs. So we'll be getting those dates and times out as soon as possible. We are doing the boot camp. That hasn't changed. For those of you that were able to participate in the boot camp last year, we had really great response. It was great hands-on, learning how to do the basics of NEMSIS. It's fabulous for any new data managers or data managers that are learning different pieces of NEMSIS. We're happy to have you on that. And a flyer will be coming out pretty soon on that. The boot camp will be August 25th. So look for a flyer for boot camp, and then keep your eyes open for date and time. That's going to be coming for the V3 annual implementation meeting. Are there any questions on either one of those? All right, sounds good. Clay, you have the next topic. And if you want to take the screen for that.
Yeah, let me share my screen if I may. Yeah, thank you, folks. Wanted to hopefully continue and perhaps finish the initial discussions about the idea of improving our ability to provide ANSI approved lists within NEMSIS, so national lists that we're required to use for NEMSIS to remain as an American standard. We've received some great clarifying comments, and I'll go over a number of those as we go through this presentation, and then I would love just one more time for folks to provide any feedback. We're clearly developing an approach here that will be approved for 3.5. That was a question that came up 2 weeks ago, and I apologize that I was less than clear about when when we would implement these changes. So I apologize for that. I'm gonna go through this slide set again, indicating to you where we've added some clarifications, and then perhaps ask for feedback if there are any additional pieces that we need to add. Remember, this is an approach we're attempting to polish, and so still there's still room to make sure that this is going to work for both the vendors and clearly for our providers. So let's talk about it. I'm not going to go really across all these slides again. I'll just pick and choose. Again, the problem that we're trying to solve really is threefold, right? There is this phenomenon that people are using different codes to describe the same thing with the current kind of suggested approach to variables that utilize ICD-10, RxNorm, SNOMED, CT. It's really open and people are utilizing a lot of different codes that, for example, represent the same thing. There also is this idea that there's so many codes that are now being used and available. And of course, that's just related to how they're presented in the GUI of the different vendor products, but we are getting a lot of different codes, and this can either cause, I think, provider fatigue, or they'll just choose their favorite, their favorite option every time they're on a trauma. They just choose pain as the impression, for example, or as a symptom. And we want to make sure that this is accurate, that it's user friendly, and that it improves the experience for our providers. So yeah, this is a problem, and it continues to grow as a problem. Here's e-injury 01. Under version 2 of NEMSIS, there were 22 choices for cause of injury, way too few. But we continue to use more and more code to define a cause of injury. 1,300 in 2017, and just this last year we used 2,100. Lots of those codes. There's no distinguishing information that represents all those different codes. When we, for example, reviewed and redid what was called the suggested lists, we were able to take really all the 1,790 codes that were in 2018, and we're able to really see that that could be represented by 80 codes, and that there could be 17 parent codes that are kind of a hierarchy that would allow EMS to drill down. We're going through the 2019 data to try to get a better feel for, provider fatigue, or using the same code often. Are there vendor products that seem to show more variability versus others? That's underway. That was a suggestion on the call 2 weeks ago, and we're kind of we're working on that now. But I would like to just talk about some of the clarifications that we were able to make in regards to the recommendations. So folks will remember we've talked about this in an implementation meeting that was held in Deer Valley in 2019. And there was this idea of retaining patterns for some elements, but for others, taking the suggested list and making it more defined. So let's kind of talk about what those decisions have kind of rolled out to look like. So let's talk about symptoms, impressions, cause of injury, incident location, time, and patient activity. These are all ICD-10 code elements that utilize ICD-10. The idea here is that the suggested list would become more, that we've developed, that captures 90% of all of the symptoms or impressions, the associated element. Greater than 90% were captured by a much smaller set of codes, making that suggested list the defined list. And there would be some expectation that that defined list with some type of a hierarchical structure to be able to navigate that list, that would be expected to be present in the GUI when a clinician attempted to complete symptoms or impressions. For specialty care, that is air medical, interfacility, critical care, for these elements, they would utilize the same defined lists. So that would not differ. Because those defined lists only captured 90% of the variability of codes that were found in the 2018 data set, we would still, values outside the defined list would still be allowed for all elements for all users based on the existing patterns that limit somewhat the use of, for example, ICD-10. That would still be available. And as Josh Legler described 2 weeks ago, there would be a standard roll-up process that would take all the codes in the defined list and any additional codes that come across with use of the pattern. There would be a standard roll-up that would be used at the state and national level to be able to standardize that data across states and at the national level. In regards to procedures and medications, it's a little bit different, mostly because for specialty care, the breadth and variability in medications and procedures grows exponentially, right? I mean, basically anything's possible. So for those two types of elements, first off, there would be an ability for us to look at code sets, particularly those that are associated with 911 response, so not specialty care. Not many states have a defined procedures or medications list for specialty care, but most, if not all, do for 911 response providers. So we would be able to look at that in the state data set and ensure that it's present. The defined list for medications and procedures would be limited to those that are approved during a 911 activated response for all levels of certification, from EMR all the way up to paramedic. That's currently in the state data set, specifically for e-medications 03 and e-procedures 03. So that's actually the actual documentation of medications and procedures. For specialty care, they could continue to rely on the existing patterns, right? So much how that's probably happening now, right, is they use a lot more additional codes. Still, even for these elements, the existing patterns again would be available for all users, and there would be a standard roll-up that would be provided for these at the state level and the federal level. So one of the requests was, can you offer some use cases to help us understand this approach and perhaps shoot holes in it, see if there's problems with it. So just 2 short slides that kind of define a use case. So for a 911 initiated ground response with either BLS or ALS care provided, the initial code values for these elements in the GUIs would be the defined list for that element with a hierarchy present to help the, some type of a hierarchy present to help the user manipulate the list. There would be national schematron rules that would enforce general use of the defined list with warnings. Patterns would still be allowable for all the elements as we talked about, and all codes would roll up to the national level. So that's kind of the use case for 911 ground response. For specialty care, it's all the same approach, except for the idea for e-medications 03 and e-procedures 03. All of the ICD-10 or SNOMED CT codes for procedures would be allowable as defined by existing patterns. So whatever approach they're using now, that would not change. There would not be a truncation of codes that are available for specialty care. So I'm gonna stop there and just ask. It's still a little highfalutin, right? I mean, how are we going to like ensure that there's a defined list in use for symptoms or for medications? It will clearly be maybe someone looking at the GUI during compliance testing or something like that, just to make sure that list is there. And then of course we can provide some sample schematron warnings that kind of show how those might work. So there's still some work to do here, but would love to hear any comments regarding kind of the refinement of this approach.
So I think it was mentioned before that there might be custom state lists that are that either extend or maybe reduce the national list. Is that part of what's the? Do you have anything to say about those?
Yeah, David. Yeah, appreciate the comment. We had talked about the idea of asking states to provide custom value lists for medications and procedures for specialty care. That's based on comments on this call and on the data manager's call, that we took that out of the recommendations. That may not be helpful.
Okay.
To answer your question more directly, David, we would be expecting all states to accept this defined list.
Okay. And what's the state of the roll up currently?
Yeah, Josh. Josh, can I put you on the spot? Do you want to speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah, we're putting some projects in place with the NEMSIS TAC to implement the roll-up in their own data systems. Those projects may be delayed slightly by the work that's being done with the PPE needs tracking project. Anyway, the specifications for those roll-ups are all completed. So, you know, where we're going to grab the data from and how we're going to parse that data to do those roll-ups. So that is something we could consider sharing fairly soon.
Okay.
Okay. So I think you mentioned that this is part of 3.5. So there's a little maybe concerned that we're trying to do the 3.5 development, but 3.5 as the standard is not finished. Is that accurate?
David, yeah, it would apply to 3.5. I think the standard is finished. The defined lists are available and on the website. So all of the tools are available. And the reason why this is not rolling out with the actual standard is because we're not like building these lists into the XML. It's just what your software is going to display or make available in regards to what was just a much larger option before. Now it's these defined lists. I know I'm speaking pretty flippantly there because there's lots of development associated with this, but I think all the tools are available and have been available to make this happen, even though we're talking about it now.
Is there the schematron file that you mentioned?
No, the schematron is not in place. Josh, we're meeting with Josh actually next Monday to talk about the development of a schematron example that folks could look at as to how a schematron might be used to ensure that the list is being utilized. So
okay. This seems a little underdeveloped. I'm not trying to be unfair about it, but
yeah.
We're trying to do the 3.5 development, but at the same time, things don't seem to be finished with this in this aspect. So, is there a timeline for this? And
well, the only I guess the only tool that remains uncompleted would be additional schematron related business rules that would be added to the national schematron file that is out there now. We'll try to define a timeline for that. I haven't had a chance to talk to Josh about that at all, and we have the PPE project that we're busy with, but we'll take a look at that, David, and we'll report that back.
Okay, and so we get 91.1% coverage, which is pretty good, but that means 1 out of every 10 is going to throw an error.
Yes.
So what's in those? Are they like, you know, just bizarre codes, or is there anyone like, well, if that's really what happened, then I guess you probably need that code? Is how much of that is there?
Yeah, it's a good question, David, and it is kind of, I think there's part of that reason was just for error codes, right? There was, I don't know, struck by duck, I don't know, hit by spacecraft. I mean, that
Yeah,
kind of stuff was happening just because there were so many codes, but that also represents a very small amount as well. I think probably the bulk of this 10% is, as you mentioned, just aberrant calls. I don't know, a surfboard caught on fire. I don't know, but there's clearly
yeah.
a subset of codes there that could be better defined with a more specific code. So yeah, there will be 10% of the time, 1 out of 10 calls, where a provider will have to respond to a warning.
Okay, and so along those lines, what is the update strategy for these codes? So if you're dealing with somebody, and we deal with several agencies who they don't want any warnings. Their pay is tied to not having any schematron warnings. So what I would really strongly recommend is, very fast turnaround strategy for, we need this code added, and, some process on, whether that could be approved or not, but, we don't want that to be, well, okay, we'll add that code in NEMSIS 3.6. Like that'd be a little hard to swallow.
Yeah, got it. The idea is to be able to update these lists. We talked about annually, but perhaps if there's a need to modify a schematron rule to allow for an additional code and adding that code to the defined list on a more frequent basis than annually, we could discuss that for sure.
Okay, so.
Hi, Clay. This is Samantha.
All right.
With ESO. I had one quick question. So after doing this analysis, will there be any updates to the defined list that are or the suggested list that are currently posted?
Also, that's a good question, Samantha. So this was the current assessment was based on the 2018 data. Are you thinking review of the 2019 data, or maybe just having us walk through the list and look for things that are missing?
So I just wanted to know, after you did everything and you did your comparisons, were you going to be adding to the existing defined list?
I don't think so. I think the defined list as it stands right now was a completion of our work based on the 2018 data.
Okay. And the defined list will continue to live in the resources section of the website and will not be added into the data dictionary?
Yes, ma'am. I think that's correct. Yep.
Okay.
We could have a link to the data dictionary or something like that. I think that's a good idea, and how we could more closely align them could be helpful.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Hey, Clay, it's Doug Butler from Image Trend. Is there a spot on the website, I don't see it, that the process of what you guys went through to vet those lists, and if it's a committee, who did it? I know that our clients are going to have those questions: is here's this list, who did it, what medical people were on it, what EMS providers were on it, or was this researchers? I think that would be a very helpful document if this moves forward.
That sounds really good, Doug. So we'll there was a process used, but there isn't a description on the website. We'll develop a description of how those lists were developed.
Hey, Clay. Go ahead, Doug.
Oh, and I would recommend you guys just looking at 2019. EMS is evolving. I know conditions are changing, and more people have been documented in version 3 in the last year. I would encourage you guys to reevaluate the 2019 data just to make sure that everything, that list, is as complete and thorough as possible.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Clay, going back to kind of what Doug said and definitely what David said earlier, if 9.91% of the PCRs that are written are going to have warnings, it's going to cause a tremendous amount of heartburn with a lot of our customers. Also, I have reservations about the fact that the TAC now says, hey, everyone who is a vendor now has to change their user interface to specifically include this hierarchical sort of notion of complaints and have everybody adhere to it, not just for ourselves, but for every vendor involved.
This is Hannah. I'm an epidemiologist in Montana, and I'm just thinking if 8.9% of those codes are not represented in the suggested list, is there a way to add an additional couple of parent codes so that the rest of those codes would be covered somehow?
Yeah, Hannah, that's a great question. We took a hard look at that. Maybe in epidemiological terms, it's considered scree, right? So these were truly the ones that were so aberrant that we couldn't find even a parent code. Clearly, codes like pain and discomfort continue to reside in the NEMSIS data set and could be used for many things. But I think that this was kind of the scree where, just like the stuff that was so hard to define another code, clearly we don't want to use other. Clearly, probably the whole 100% could be covered by the codes that are there. But if these codes were correct, then they weren't. There was a better code, right? There was a better description of it. So yeah, you could cover 100% with the current list, but if you've got struck by spacecraft, and that's a bad example. We'll come up with a couple of good examples that we can share that just will indicate that yeah, you could have covered that, for example, with a car crash code, but you wouldn't have captured what seems to be the additional detail that was trying to be captured by a different ICD-10 code. So yeah, it's not like there's some things that you just could not describe at all, right? Does that help, Hannah, to describe it a little?
It does. I guess I'd be interested, like Doug was saying, to know more about the process of how these lists were created, because I know at least with hospital discharge data, there's constant work going on around kind of defining indicators and lists, and it's a huge field of study. So I'd be interested just to see how that's being translated into EMS.
You bet, Hannah. Yeah, thank you. We'll prepare that.
And Clay, similar to what Hannah said, I mean, if you imagine being a medic and maybe having a surfboard incident because you're a medic in some surf town, and every time you put in the surfboard code or whatever, you end up with a warning. You sort of just get fatigued to it, right?
Yeah.
And then you ignore the warnings a lot more than you were ignoring before. And like he was saying earlier, there are organizations that, you know, if you have warnings, then you can actually be disciplined for it. So
yeah, and that's an interesting. Yeah, Keenan, thank you for bringing that up, and that's been mentioned. I appreciate that by David as well. I mean, that's an interesting application of warnings. We'll have. I don't know how we can approach that. That's clearly what it's not meant by a warning. We have failures for those type of situations where we're sure that there's an error, and we maintain warnings because there are situations where this constellation of codes would be clearly possible, but would be rare, right? I mean, that's the definition of a warning. So the fact that someone would be penalized because they saw a somewhat rare event and accurately documented it is an interesting application of warning.
Clay,
It's
we've
definitely
got
a
a,
thing. Also, really quick, while I'm on my soapbox, a lot of us have made commitments to our business and to our stakeholders that we would be 3.5 compliant by X date, or be at certain milestones by certain dates. And this kind of feels like, you know, every couple of implementation calls, there's a new goalpost that's, you know, 30 yards further down the field. And I just want to sort of bring that up and make sure that everybody on the call sort of understands that that's a thing. We have to commit some of this stuff to the people above us and around us, and we don't want the 3.5 standard changing, but so much.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. I appreciate that, and I appreciate you bringing it up. And if others have that same feeling, would love to hear it. We're of course trying to work hard to balance the request of the state data managers to provide some kind of parameters around these elements that are making it very difficult to utilize the data that's coming back to the state, and they're hearing from their providers about the inability of them to use the data correctly because it's just so overwhelming. So we're trying to find some common ground that clearly it may be additional work, but I think customers could be happier, as well as the states and downstream users. So it's.
I think you got a really big step with the roll-up approach, and I'm kind of thinking about, you know, how much does the roll-up approach get us in terms of alleviating the pain, especially with the state data managers who want to do the research. They get a lot of benefit from that, from the roll-up codes out of the box, and that's entirely on the state side as opposed to the field.
Yeah, that goes a long way, I think, to their secondary concern, and that is the use of the data. I think the bulk, or at least from what I've heard, the bulk of their complaints and concerns has been the provider experience. And
who are the they that we're referencing, Clay?
Data managers in several states. Would it be valuable to? So we work with the
I don't think we need specifics on whom. I'm just saying what level of interaction. So data managers primarily, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Just they're concerned about the quality of the data that comes out, and then the complaint of the provider. So yeah, the roll up makes everything have less categories, which is helpful, right? Because then it can be used. But I think the primary underlying concern is the accuracy of the data and the complaints about how hard it is to manipulate code sets.
Clay, we've got a couple of questions in chat. Could the suggested list be in a more consumable format than the Excel spreadsheet? So is there a different format that would be more usable to vendors than an Excel spreadsheet?
Yeah, this is Amanda from ImageTrend. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering if this would, and get other vendors' thoughts on this, if there'd be maybe a web service that we could call to get the values, and that would help us keep it up to date if they're going to change more often in the future, instead of having to go download a spreadsheet from the website.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a valuable idea. Do other software companies have just a thought about that?
This is Jeremy at TraumaSoft. I think that would be great. It'd be nice to hit that.
Thank you.
This is Samantha from ESO. I think there's value in having both because I know that sometimes we point our customers to the defined list, and so it still needs to be consumable and human readable format for them as well.
Okay.
But a web service would be nice as well.
And then another question from Mark Roberts. If there's any input or suggestions, has any agency come up with funding for the states to be able to roll the changes out? So if there's any discussion on that, we'd love to entertain that as well.
Yeah, perhaps the question wasn't well understood. Has any agency come up with funding for the states to roll these changes out? So agencies funding things for the states. Is that what you were trying to say, Mark? Perhaps he's not on with audio.
I think maybe he's referring to federal agencies.
Oh, okay. So federal funds for the rollout of this or 3.5, I'm sure, or other things. Yeah, this is a long-standing concern. I don't think the Office of EMS is on the call. Eric very much wanted to be on the call, but he was called away for a medical appointment. I'm just checking quickly to see if he's on the line. He hoped to get back in time, but he may not be here yet. So. Any other comments regarding this idea of a suggested the suggested list and the idea of defined lists? These have been great comments, and we'll.
Dr. Mann?
Yeah. Yes.
You were mentioning that this is one. You were mentioning that the data set builder would be used to check the defined list. As our state of Florida does not have a scope of operating, they don't have a practice that tells you which procedures and medications are used. So ours would still remain empty. Will that be an issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. One, I think the fact that both the medications and procedures are currently in the state data set just allows us to provide a check on those lists that could clearly vary by state, right? So the list of symptoms, the defined list for symptoms would not change by state, but clearly medications and procedures by level of certification certainly could. So that the fact that they're in the state data set, I think provides a way for us to validate those. But if your state does not provide such a list, if your deconfiguration elements related to procedures, medications are just left blank, then that would just be true for Florida.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Juan. That was a good one.
And there's one more question about the spreadsheets that are available on the website dated September, October of 2019. Yes, those are the lists developed from the 2018 data.
All right, well, we'll move on. I would clearly welcome any additional comments in the chat, or if you'd like to speak on the phone, I would love to have a conversation. If there's other issues related to this that we need to make sure that we address. This is a complicated issue, but one that we need to try to get a handle on in some way.
I think with some of the stuff we mentioned before, we need to have before we can make additional comments.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Okay, David. Yeah, fair enough. And, and, and what I think you're referring to, David, is two things. We're doing an analysis looking at variability by software and by state and type of a provider to see if we can provide some boundaries around this idea of provider fatigue. I'm sure it's happening, but just trying to capture the scope of that would be helpful. And then the other item I think you're talking about, David, is an example of how schematron would be applied in this instance. Is that correct?
well, we talked about the deliverables of the NEMSIS side development, as well as the approach, the methodology of developing these lists. So remember, when the suggested lists were developed, there was a extensive amount of work done by very high-level medical people, and like was mentioned, I'm not sure that that's been done, as well as what is the release cycle possible for these ones if we do need to add a code and we don't want to wait a year. So I think there's a lot that hasn't been nailed down that we kind of need in place before we can fully vet and fully comment on this aspect. The timeline seems really tight, and probably even it's kind of past due even, since 3.5 is released and we're still waiting on stuff.
All right, thank you, David. We'll make it a top priority to get those things out.
Are there any other questions or comments while we're still on this topic?
Okay, Julianne, thank you. I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. Next is just an announcement for the public training on July 7th. Clay is going to present EMS by the numbers, impact of COVID-19 on EMS response. This will be very informative of how the EMS data has been used in such a timely manner to understand the impact of COVID on EMS response. So there'll be a flyer coming out for that probably in the next day or two, but that is July 7th, 10 a.m. Mountain Time, and we'll send you the connection information for that. Next on the agenda, items from Office of EMS, and as Clay had stated, Eric wasn't able to join us today. Clay, would you speak for just a few minutes on the PPE critical needs tracking that we're investigating?
Sure, happy to do that. I was trying to run through the list real quickly of 92 people to see if Eric was able to join. Eric, are you on? Okay, happy to share. So I'll just let folks know where we are on that process. So in the last call, Eric made the point that it was important to the Office of EMS under the direction of FEMA and HHS to come up with some mechanism whereby they'd be able to answer questions regarding shortages in PPE and where there may be some limitations in care because PPE was not available. Talked about, could we add something to the DEM file? Can we add custom elements to NEMSIS to collect this information? The idea gleaned by this group was to completely divorce it from the NEMSIS standard and maybe just have a form that's available on a website that would ask these questions that EMS could complete on a regular basis, or if they had needs for PPE. So I just wanted, and so that's the approach that they've taken. And I just wanted to run by the vendors here the questions that they're thinking of asking, because clearly there may be some overlap in regards to emergency management questions that have been asked early on in 2020 related to COVID. And I think they're kind of okay with that overlap. I'll just present it. And then of course, if you have questions to Eric, feel free to contact him via email. So there's a section that they filled out that will just describe the agency. You can see it here at the kind of at the beginning of these questions. They're asking for numbers of EMS personnel to be able to define some of the questions lower on, how big of an issue they are. So you can see the second group of questions relates to COVID, and kind of the idea is that this form could be completed weekly on a Monday morning, for example. So they'd be asking in the past 7 days for each agency, what's your total confirmed providers with COVID, suspected, and any deaths that may have occurred in the last 7 days. Also asking a related question that is, and maybe also related to volume of calls, which was really variable with in the spring, is the EMS organization undergoing any shortages in personnel as of today, or do they anticipate any shortages in personnel within the next week? Then a final question that really kind of gets down as to actual adequate supply PPE by type of supply item. So for every type of supply item, these questions are asked. And the form on the website will be a lot more intuitive, so I apologize. This is just a mock-up. So supply on hand, 0 days, all the way up to 15 or more days for each of the supply items. Are you currently reusing this item or attempting to extend its use? A yes or no? Are you able to obtain this item through normal purchasing procedures? Yes or no? Have you submitted requests for resupply through the emergency management or public health process that's in place with the pandemic at any time? And if you have submitted a request, has your most recent request been filled? A complete order was provided, a partial order was provided, or it has not been filled. So, so that's kind of a storyboarding of the questions that would be included in this website form that the Office of EMS would request be completed on a weekly basis. Any questions related to that or any discussion that you'd like to have? I know I wish Eric was here to hear it, but if there is some discussion, we'd be happy to pass it on. Okay, hearing none, I'll pass it back over to you, Julianne.
Right. Are there any comments or questions, issues that anybody on the call would like to bring forward in open forum?
Hey, Julianne, this is Brian in Virginia. I had one quick thing I just wanted to bring up if I could have about 90 seconds.
You can have it.
All right, since all the vendors are here, I just wanted to give everybody a heads up. This goes back to a notice Virginia sent out to all the vendors and the licensed agencies in Virginia back in February, and it had to do with the submission of non-compliant values. And all this was based on our current data dictionary, which was published in September of 2018. The notice announced Virginia's intent to suspend the ability for any agency to electronically submit data if the organization didn't become compliant by May 1st of 2020. So we've just started this week reviewing the May data. So again, just kind of wanted to give everybody a heads up. When we finish the review, I have to send that over to our agency leadership. And then once they look at all of this, they will come back and tell me, which agencies to start turning off. I do anticipate sending out notices to the agencies and the vendors, letting them know that, hey, for the month of May, you sent X, Y, and Z. Based on our letter of February, we're going to go ahead and turn this off until you can show us that you can send compliant data. And then and also just to let everyone know that when we did send those notices out, we made sure that we included a list of what was coming through that was non-compliant and guidance on what actually needed to be sent. So not going to take up much time on this, but if any of the vendors on the call have any questions, you go to the NEMSIS website, click on Virginia, shoot me an email, and I'm more than happy to get on the phone, try to figure out, kind of what's going on. If there's anything that we can do to help, if there's any challenges that you're having trying to send us the data that we're looking for, whatever I can do to help, I'm more than willing. All right, that's all I had. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. This is a terrific forum for that. We appreciate you sharing that today. Any questions for Brian while you've got him on the phone? Are there any other questions, comments, concerns that anyone wants to bring forward at this time? Please feel free to reach out to any member of the Technical Assistance Center with your questions, comments, concerns. We're happy to have those discussions, and it really is very valuable to us when you provide that feedback and we're able to work with that information. The next call will be July 8th, same time, same place. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy day. We sincerely appreciate your comments and participation in these discussions. They are truly valuable. Thank you, everyone, for being with us this morning. Have a great day.